Welcome to the Azure Marketplace Lab Series. We're here to help you gain familiarity with some of the partner solutions that are available in the Azure Marketplace. These are 200 technical level sessions, roughly, just about the different available partner technologies that are in the Azure Marketplace today. My name is Steve Ross, and I'm from OpsAgility. And today's lab is going to be covering the deployment and configuration of the Cisco CSR 1000v routers available in Azure. So I do want you to submit your questions if you have any in the chat window. I do have colleagues online that are standing by ready to answer those questions. And with that, let's dive right in. So in terms of the scenario that we'll be covering today, we're going to deploy two CSR 1000v appliances in different virtual networks and in different Azure regions. Once we have those deployed, we're going to configure IPsec VPN, an IPsec VPN between those two appliances, and then we're going to validate connectivity between the virtual networks using that IPsec VPN. There are prerequisites for this lab. You will need an active Azure subscription, and you will also need an SSH client of your choice. I'll be using PuTTY for the purposes of the demo today. So I want to walk through this diagram. It really describes sort of visually what we'll be deploying. If you start on the left-hand side, you'll see that there is a virtual network that's deployed in the South Central US region. There are two subnets in this virtual network, and there's an Ubuntu VM that's deployed in the private subnet. Also notice that the CSR 1000v is deployed. It has two network interfaces, so it participates in both subnets. Now on the right-hand side, it is very much the same type of deployment. We have a virtual network in the North Central US region with two subnets, again an Ubuntu virtual machine deployed in the private subnet, and a CSR 1000v that's deployed in both subnets. And the final thing we'll be doing as a part of the lab is that IPsec VPN configuration to set that up and validate connectivity. So before we get started in the lab itself, just a quick note about what the CSR 1000v is. So this is a full-featured Cisco IOS XE router that enables enterprise-class networking services in the Azure cloud. So there are many common use cases for this router, but one of the most predominant use cases is enabling hybrid networking configurations. So think of connecting my on-premise environment into an Azure virtual network, or maybe even connecting an AWS virtual network into an Azure virtual network. And today, the scenario we'll actually be walking through is configuring two Azure virtual networks to be able to pass traffic between them. So with that, we're going to jump right in to the lab. The first step that we'll walk through is actually deploying the first CSRV in the South Central US region. So I'm in the Azure portal here. If I click on Microsoft Azure, I come to sort of the first page, the dashboard, if you will. To start the deployment, I'll click on the New button. And in the search marketplace, I'm just going to type in Cisco CSR 1000v. Okay, and when I hit enter, I'm going to get back two different options to choose from. I want to deploy the option that has two network interfaces, so I'm going to click on this top option here. So on the marketplace page for this appliance, I get a little bit of information about the scenarios I can use it for. This particular device can only be deployed in the Resource Manager framework, so that looks good. I'm going to go ahead and click Create to start. So I'll have four blades of information to fill out. The first one is going to be the basics blade. So we'll just call this machine the CSR 1000v. And I'm going to use the same consistent username and password throughout all of the demo, just to make things a little bit easier. I'll be using demo user and demo at pass123 for the password. Definitely select your subscription if you have multiple ones. And then we're going to provision a specific resource group for this to exist in. And we'll just call this Cisco Lab Resource Group 1. And again, I'm provisioning sort of that left side of the diagram that I showed you. So I'm going to provision this into the South Central US region. Okay. The next blade is the Cisco CSR settings blade. Now notice that a standard D2 V2 instance is already selected here, and that's going to be good for what we need. So in the storage account, I'll click Configure Required Settings, and I'm just going to give this a name. Now this name does have to be unique, so once I've entered in the name, I'll tab out and make sure I get a green check mark here. So once I see that I have that green check mark, then I know that I can move forward. All of the rest of the options on this blade are good for what we need. Next, I'm going to configure the public IP address of this appliance. So I'll click on Configured Required Settings, and we're going to create a new public IP. And I do want to select this to be static, so I'll click on Static, make sure I get the green check mark for the name, and click OK. The next thing we'll provision is a DNS label for this appliance. So you'll notice sometimes that I'm entering in some extraneous characters on the end. That's because it has to be unique on the internet. So I see by the green check mark that it is. Now I'll click on Virtual Network, and this particular deployment is going to basically pre-configure a virtual network for me called VNet01, and I want to retain that name. The only thing I want to change here is I'm going to be using the 10.0.0.0/16 address space. Now you may, when you walk through this demo or this lab, you may get this warning that's saying that the address space is in use. That's not a problem for this particular lab. As long as I'm not going to be connecting to that other virtual network, it's not an issue. So we'll accept this setting and click OK. And next we're going to configure the subnets. Now remember that this appliance has two network interface cards, so we have two different subnets we'll provision this into. The first one we're going to call public subnet, and that'll be using the 10.0.0.0/24 address space, and the other one will be private subnet. Okay, everything looks good here, so I'll click OK. And everything is now set on the Cisco CSR settings blade, so I'll click OK here. Now I'm going to receive a summary. It's going to kind of check things out and make sure everything I've selected is appropriate. I see that I've passed the validation, so that looks good. I'll click OK there. And the last blade is the purchase blade. Because this is a partner solution in the Azure Marketplace, you do have to confirm that you want to purchase it. Now in this case, we're using basically a trial license and there is nothing to purchase. So all that we'll be paying, if you will, is the compute cost of the virtual machine. Okay. Now if I was deploying this virtual machine right now, I'd go ahead and click Purchase. I have pre-built the virtual machine just for the purposes of making this lab run through a little bit more smoothly. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Resource Groups and look for the Cisco Lab RG Resource Group. And this contains that CSR 1000v appliance that I've already provisioned. So when I click on the appliance, I'm going to get some information here on the Essentials blade, including the public IP address, which is what I'm going to need next. Okay, so I now see the public IP address for the Cisco appliance. So what I want to do now is putty into this appliance. I mainly want to do this for the purposes of showing you what the interface looks like and give you a familiarity with some of the different commands that you can run. So I'm going to enter in the IP address here. And I'm going to also just save this session so that I can use it a little bit easier in the future. And I'm just going to zoom in so you can see those settings a little bit easier. So I've just got the public IP address here, and I've entered in a name. Okay, then I'm just going to click OK. Or first I'm going to click Save, and then I'll click OK to open. Now we'll log in using the credentials that we provided earlier when we built this appliance. And that's demo user and demo at pass123. So the first command that I'll run is show version. And this is going to show us the version of the appliance that we've deployed. And because Cisco is continuously updating the appliance, this version will change. If you deploy it 1 week, the next week it may be an incremented version, but you can see the version number here. Okay. And the next command I want to run is the show license command. So even though we've not licensed or applied a license to the appliance, there are some features that are still licensed, and we're still going to be able to connect that IPsec VPN. So I can look through and check out the various capabilities that are licensed on the appliance here with the show license command. And the next thing I want to do is the show IP interface brief command. So this is going to show us the different interfaces that are assigned. And remember, we chose the one that has 2 interfaces. So this looks good. The one thing that is not right currently is that Gigabit Ethernet interface is unassigned and is not online right now. So I need to fix that. So I'm going to run a series of commands here. Now specifically the commands that I'm running are, first I need to enter into a configuration mode, which you see here. And then I'm basically going to specify the interface and I'm going to bring it up to use DHCP. Okay. So now that I've run this command, I'm going to take a look once more at the interfaces to make sure that it's up. You may notice there that I abbreviated the commands. So the Cisco iOS does support you abbreviating commands. And I can see that my interfaces are up and operational, so that's great. Okay, so the next step we'll do in our lab is provision the second CSR 1000v appliance in the north central US region. So I'm just going to go ahead and exit out of my PuTTY screen here. And again, I'll click on the New button in the upper left to start this provisioning process. Okay, and again, I'm going to choose the one with 2 network interfaces and click on Create. This one we'll call a Remote CSR 1000v. We'll continue using that same username and password. And we will create a new resource group for this as well, since it will be in another region. And we'll just call this Remote Cisco Lab RG. And the last region I chose was South Central. This time we'll choose North Central, the paired region. We'll actually call this Remote Cisco Lab RG1. Okay. Couple of things to note here on the next blade, the Cisco CSR settings blade for this second appliance. So I will have to create a storage account again for this appliance. And I will need to provision another public IP address, of course. And do you remember we want this to be a static interface, so I'll click on static. Here's my DNS label. And just make sure again we get the green check mark indicating that it is unique. Now here's a couple of things that are different on this blade that I want to make sure to highlight. So I'll click on the virtual network setting here just like I did before, but I want to name this virtual network something different. We'll call this remote VNet 01, and I'm going to go ahead and use the 10.10.0.0/16 address space. Again, I might receive this warning, no big deal because it's not going to impact my lab. So I'll click OK. And lastly, on this blade, I'll configure the subnets for this virtual network. Again, we'll use the public subnet for the first interface and private for the second. Okay, all looks well on this blade, so I'll click OK, and OK to finish up this blade settings. Again, there is a validation that will run through here. My validation has passed. And again, there's the last blade where I would actually click purchase if I was going to provision this virtual machine. Now I have also already provisioned this particular appliance just to save time again. So I'll go ahead and click on Microsoft Azure rather than configuring another appliance. And I'll go to Resource Groups, and this time I'll look for the Remote Cisco Lab RG Resource Group. Here is the appliance that I have already provisioned, so I'm going to click on it. Again, I'm going to want to SSH into this appliance to configure some settings, so I need its public IP address. Okay, so we'll open back up PuTTY and enter in the IP address for this remote appliance. And again, I'll name this and save it just in order to make sure that we are able to more quickly get into it in the next time that we want to access it. And I'll click Open. Now, you will see this security alert that the server's host key isn't cached on the machine the first time you connect. That's fine. We'll click Yes. And we'll log in with the same credentials. Okay, so I want to do the same commands I did on the first appliance in order to bring it up or bring up that second interface. It will not be up until you run these commands to cause it to be operational. So I'll just copy these commands. Okay, so that's bringing the interface up. Then I want to make sure that it is up, in fact. So I'll Control-Z out of the configuration mode. And show IP interface brief in order to see that both of my interfaces are up. So I may have ran the command just a little too quickly. It may take a second for DHCP to assign the address. So I'll run it once more. Yep, and sure enough, I see that both of them have an IP address, so that's exactly what we want. Okay, so for now I'm going to exit out of this appliance as well. And the next thing that we're going to do is provision the virtual machines that you remember from the diagram in both virtual networks so that we can use them to validate connectivity once we've established that IPsec VPN. So again, I will start by clicking on the New button. And this time I'm just going to choose virtual machines. And I'm going to deploy Ubuntu servers for the purpose of validating connectivity. I do want to select the resource management framework here, so that looks good. I'll click on Create. I'll just call this local VM 01. I'll save a little bit of money on my subscription by choosing HDD for the drives I'm just going to use these for a small amount of time. And again, I'm going to use the same credentials. Now notice for an Ubuntu server and really any Linux server we provision, we could use an SSH public key for authentication, but we're going to go ahead and use a password and use that same password we've been using. And we'll create, actually we're going to use an existing resource group here. I'm going to go ahead and place the virtual machine in the same resource group where the appliance exists in the South Central US region. So I will select the Cisco Lab RG resource group. And again, here is South Central US, so this looks good. I'll click OK. Now we want to choose a size for our virtual machine. Remember, we're just really using this to validate connectivity, so it does not have to be a very highly performing virtual machine at all. I'm going to choose the F1 standard virtual machine size. I'll click that and then I'll click Select. Okay, so a storage account will be provisioned for me. The main things that I want to select on this virtual machine is I want to make sure it participates in the same virtual network that my appliances are participating in. So I'll click on Virtual Network and I want to choose VNet 01. And then I'm going to click on Subnet. Now I want this virtual machine to exist in the private subnet, so I'll click on Private Subnet here. And then on the public IP address, I'm just going to remove the public IP address configuration by clicking None. And I'm going to do the same thing for the network security group. And that is all the settings that I need to configure. So with that, I'll click OK. And lastly, I have my summary screen that I can click in order to provision the virtual machine. Now again, in order to save time for our demo purposes, I've pre-provisioned these virtual machines. I wanted to walk through that just to show you the settings that are necessary. So let's take a look at our resource group just to see this. If I click on Resource Groups and I click on Cisco Lab RG, you can see in the resource group that I have my appliance, and I also have the Ubuntu virtual machine here in the local resource group, South Central US region. And in my remote Cisco Lab RG, I have the appliance that is the remote CSR 1000v there, and my remote virtual machine in that North Central US region. So the next step that we're going to do in our lab is provision our IPsec tunnel. And in order to do that, I need to SSH into the first appliance, the CSR 1000v. So because I've saved that, I'll just simply click on 1000v, CSR 1000v, and I will log in. Okay. I'm going to run a series of commands here, and I will discuss briefly with you what these commands are doing. First thing we're doing is entering into configuration mode on the appliance. Then we're defining an IPsec default policy that is going to secure the traffic. And we are also specifying a fully qualified domain name for the local appliance and setting up the pre-shared key that will be used to encrypt traffic on both sides, the local and the remote side. Okay. The next thing that we want to do is to provision the tunnel interface. So you remember this device has two interfaces, but we want to provision a virtual interface, in effect, a tunnel interface that will connect between the two appliances, enabling that IPsec tunnel to exist. Okay, so what these commands are accomplishing are they are creating that interface tunnel 0, applying an IP address configuration to it, And we're specifying which particular physical address that it will be using, as well as the destination public IP address we'll be connecting to. Now we also do need to set up what is called dead peer detection for both of these appliances. So I will run this command in order to enable dead peer protection. Okay, now that we have these settings set up on the first CSR appliance, I'm going to take a look at the crypto IPsec profile. I'll zoom in here a little bit so you can see. So we see the settings of the profile here that we've just created, including things like the particular encryption techniques that will be used to secure the traffic in the IPsec tunnel. Okay, now the last thing that I need to do on this appliance is I need to configure a routing protocol. So we'll be using the EIGRP routing protocol in order to route traffic between the two interfaces on the CSR 1000v appliance. So these commands that I've just run are simply configuring EIGRP on this appliance and specifying the networks that it needs to be aware of, like the tunnel network and both of the different networks that are on the appliance. Okay, so that really completes the configuration of the local side of the IPsec tunnel. So with that, I'm going to exit out of this portal session, and I will go ahead and SSH into the remote CSR 1000v in order to make similar configurations to set up this tunnel. Just like on the local side, I'll start by configuring the IPsec profile that's going to secure the traffic. Again, these are the same commands except for the FQDN or fully qualified domain name. It's being specified for this particular appliance. And we also want to set up that tunnel interface just like we did. We also want to set up that tunnel interface just like we did on the local CSR side. So I'll copy these commands in order to provision that tunnel interface. And notice that this is using a different IP address. The local appliance is using the .1 and the remote appliance will be using the .2 address in this address space. Again, we want to set up dead peer protection on this side, on that remote side of the tunnel that we'll configure. And we also want to set up EIGRP so that we can route traffic between the two interfaces on this remote CSR 1000v. Okay. Notice the 10.10.1.0 and 10.10.0.0 addresses that are local to that remote CSR 1000v. Okay. So now that we've configured the tunnel and we've configured EIGRP, let's take a look at what are called the EIGRP neighbors. In other words, the neighbors where routes are being shared. So if I do a show IP EIGRP neighbors, let's just expand this out a little bit and run that one more time. You're going to see that from the remote CSR 1000v, I am connecting already via EIGRP to that local CSR 1000v. And I'm passing routes between them, basically. Let's also take a look at the crypto session that has been set up between the appliances based on these commands that we've run. So I'll do show crypto session. And note that our tunnel is configured and that the status of it is up and active. So this is exactly what we want to see. Again, this is the remote side, the north central US side. So you can see that we are connecting to that south central appliance. There is its public IP address. One other thing I want to show you is the IP routes. Now we turned on EIGRP in order to enable routing. So note here that EIGRP routes are designated by D in this legend of the routing types. And you can see that I have 2 of those routes that are set up going across that tunnel based on what we've just configured. So this looks good. This is exactly what we want to see. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this SSH session. And there are just maybe 2 more steps we need to configure in the Azure portal itself in order to make routing work between these 2 appliances. Now, Azure leverages something called system routes to route traffic, where the Azure Fabric is doing the routing itself. But we want to leverage something called a route table in order to bypass that behavior. We want to be able to dictate that the next hop of our traffic is going to leverage these appliances that we've just provisioned. So in order to do that, I'm going to click on the Cisco Lab RG resource group. And there are 2 route tables that you'll see here that were pre-created or created by the deployment of the appliance here. And specifically, we are going to change the configuration of this one that's called Private Subnet CSR Route Table. So I will click on this route table. Now you'll notice right now that this route table has a single route defined. And what we want to do is provision 1 more route. And so I'll click on Routes here under Settings, and I'll click Add. And we'll call this to remote private. So we're going to be connecting using the local CSR appliance to that remote CSR appliance and to the networks that it participates in. So the address prefix that we want to be able to connect to is that private address space on the remote side, and that's 10.10.1.0/24. We do want to use the next hop type of virtual appliance, and we'll specify the IP address of the local CSR appliance, and that's 10.0.1.4. Okay. Now while that route is being added, we're going to go ahead and make the same type of change on the route table provisioned for the remote CSR 1000 appliance. So I'll click on Resource Groups here and go to Remote Cisco Lab RG. Again, this has that appliance, and it also has the route tables that were provisioned with the appliance. So I'll click on Private Subnet CSR Route Table. Again, I'll click on Routes and Add. And this will be, we'll call this to Local Private. Now the local or the South Central Region private subnet is 10.0.1.0. So that is the address prefix that we want to go to. Again, we'll choose our next top type of virtual appliance, and we'll enter in the IP address of the appliance that is in the North Central Region, since that's what will route that traffic for us. Okay, so I see that route has been successfully added. So we have completed the configuration of the IPsec tunnel, and we have set up the routing within Azure itself in order to be able to route traffic between these 2 appliances. All that remains really is for us to test this routing of traffic. So what I'll do in order to test that is I want to SSH into one of the Ubuntu virtual machines that I provisioned. Now it does not have a public IP address, so I'll first SSH into the appliance, the CSR 1000v, and from that appliance I will SSH into the Ubuntu server. So let's go to CSR 1000v here. So I've completed the login, the SSH into the appliance. Now I want to SSH into the virtual machine. Now let's take a look at what that virtual machine's private address is. So I'll click on Cisco Lab RG, this resource group. Here is the virtual machine that I want to SSH into. So I'll click on it. Then I will click on its network interface here. And I can see that that address is 10.0.1.5. Okay? So from here we'll simply SSH. We'll pass the -L parameter, which is going to allow us to specify the username. And then we'll enter in the IP address of the box we want to SSH into. Okay, we're prompted for the password, which is the same as the appliance. Okay, so I can see that we have logged in to this Ubuntu server. You can see that right here. So that looks good. So all that remains is for us to ping the remote Ubuntu server to make sure that we're able to pass packets. So I'll issue the ping command and 10.10.1.5, which is the private address of that Linux VM. And when I click or hit enter, I can see that I am in fact able to ping. Notice I passed, 5 packets there, and all of them are successful with no loss. So having done that last step to validate connectivity, we've actually concluded our lab here. We've provisioned 2 Cisco CSR 1000v appliances in Azure, one in one virtual network in one region and the other in a different virtual network in a different region. We also configured the IPsec VPN between those appliances, and we validated connectivity. So definitely want to thank you for watching and participating in this demo. I hope it was helpful for you. I also hope you'll go out and check out this particular partner offering in the Azure Marketplace, as well as other partner offerings in the Azure Marketplace that are there for you to use. Again, I'm Steve Ross with Opsgility, and thank you very much for participating.